Hey there, Marina here. I was inspired to make this video. I just got back from yoga class, as you can see, and there was a post in the Facilitator community today about the difference between crying and letting yourself really go into crying deeply as a release or not. I don't know all the comments of the threads of the post, but while I was in yoga, I had, like in 2 different poses, I had some release. And what that meant for me, what that means for me, is I'm not really thinking about anything, but I notice there's some thoughts, and then there is emotion, sensation in my body, and somehow, as I focus on both, this tends to happen for me, it all goes down into my belly, into the shaking as tears come down my face. So even though it's an awareness of thought, emotion, and some kind of realization happens at the same time, and then my body kind of takes over, specifically more in my belly, and starts to shake. And for me, that feels like a release versus indulging in dramatic tears and crying. So I wanted to make this video because I do think there are 2 different kinds of tears. Well, there's many kinds of tears. We laugh, cry too, and we can cry in so many ways, and there's not really any specific ways. But there is, in my experience, a very big difference between when I'm crying and really in my head, talking, angry, crying about something. It doesn't really feel like a release. It feels very much like a churning, indulging. Usually it would be like vent to somebody, crying. That feels very much more like I'm perpetuating a problem and I'm just feeding it and I'm indulging it and I'm just building a story and continuing my story about it. It feels more like a heady crying. There's a lot of words, it's much more dramatic, versus when I've had work done on massage tables. Now in my yoga practice, the more I go, I'm able to touch a spot, some kind of spot in me. It's very different, and I'm not trying to look for it, but it just kind of spontaneously happens where I have a release. Like at a hip opening pigeon pose that I was in, and suddenly I realized my thoughts started racing about someone, and I'm going through some loss. And I was very surprised how suddenly I put the 2 and 2 together, that as I was in this pose is when these thoughts started coming up and racing. And then some emotion, some sensation in my chest was rising, and somehow realizing, wow, I'm really here, I'm really just letting this be here, and just loving myself, allowing these thoughts to come, allowing the sensations to come. And the next thing I knew, I started convulsing, just like a shaking in my belly, and had a nice cry, just silently. And it felt very much, even in that moment, I'm focusing into that. It was a release, because the thoughts ceased, and peace remained. So that's another thing I wanted to say, is I think there's a difference between that kind of indulgent crying. So whether you're working on yourself, tapping, or any other release method, it really doesn't matter. I think tapping is a wonderful way to access those deep, stuck emotions, where you have access to that kind of deep release kind of cry. But if you're tapping and just wailing and talking and you want to tell your story, it's not the same kind of release. That's when it's time to stop and rest and notice how you know inside what's bothering you. You don't have to force the tears. They will come when you're releasing, if they come. They don't have to. But in my experience, there's a big difference between that kind of cry, the deep release kind from the belly. It's almost like there's been some talk about on the forum, also on Facebook and different places, about the trauma release technique exercises that are brought in. And just briefly on that, basically animals, after they have some kind of high energy adrenal, like running, being chased, or chasing something, they have these tremors that they shake off afterwards. and that can happen for us naturally as well. There's different exercises to induce those tremors. There's a lot about that. It's called TRE. But that's what it kind of feels like with this kind of crying that happens for me. It's much more of a tremoring release, and it's very much from my core, from my belly, versus from my head. And the tears, it's almost like they squirt out because that's just what the body does, versus lots and lots of tears and crying in a very verbal way. Although I've had a release both ways, where I started crying in a verbal way and then it ended up going down into my belly and kind of shaking out and releasing. So I just wanted to share that with you because there has been a question about, do you let yourself, at what point is it a good release to cry, and at what point are you indulging and just going to the story and going to the drama and that kind of crying? What's the balance? How does a practitioner who's holding that space for someone know when to let that happen? And I think it's just intuitive that way. For me, what I've noticed is I do let my clients have their release. There's a big difference between kind of like I said, the verbal, angry, perpetuating story kind of cry versus suddenly in the middle of, in that space of witnessing and looking and seeing images, words, how they're doing their problem, there'll be a deeper cry from that. That's been my experience anyway, so I just wanted to share that for whatever's worth. If it's helpful to you. Curious about your experience. Can you see a difference between your different kinds of crying? I know I have an angry cry and a laughter cry, and definitely body work, and that kind of release. So just curious how that resonates with you, what you think about it, have you noticed for you, and what your thoughts are. Oh yeah, so I also wanted to highlight and make sure that I say this too, and add it into my video, that that kind of deep release cry usually is followed by much of relief and peace and almost an emptied out feeling, a stillness. That was in my experience in yoga tonight. But also I've noticed that kind of crying in my past as well usually is followed by kind of a silence. The other kind of cries just goes on and on and on. So just wanted to highlight that too. Thanks for watching. Bye.